The beams from the lamps cast dancing, eerie shadows on the ancient walls, bringing them to life. Dust, untouched for thousands of years, swirled in the light, revealing secrets long buried. The sweat-soaked men stood frozen as the deathly silence was shattered by a low, bone-chilling groan escaping from the shifting lid of the sarcophagus. Inch by inch, the gap widened. The men leaned closer, their anticipation palpable, their faces illuminated by the golden glow that began to spill from within. For 3,300 years, no human eyes had gazed upon what lay inside. Treasures beyond imagination, riches that defied belief. But in their excitement, they missed it. The shadow stirring within the glow, ancient and vengeful, they had awakened something that should have stayed buried. The curse of Tutankhamun had returned, merciless, unrelenting. Their fate was sealed. They would soon pay the price for their intrusion with their lives. Okay, maybe you don't believe in magic or hexes, but the curse of Tutankhamun was no laughing matter. Men who were there that day did, in fact, begin to die, one after another, under mysterious circumstances. There are two stars of this story, both of whom might have upset King Tut when they rudely interrupted his 3 millennia of slumber. One of them is the British Egyptologist Howard Carter, the other his wealthy benefactor, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. With a name like that, it's no surprise he was part of the British aristocracy. He had money to burn, and burn it he did. He funded Carter and other Egyptologists to explore the land of the pyramids, where the British were hard at work appropriating artifacts for the British Museum, better known as the warehouse of centuries-old loot. Before Lord Carnarvon came on the scene, Carter had been digging in Egypt's Valley of the Kings under the auspices of the wealthy American businessman Theodore M. Davis. Carter didn't have much success in those days. His excavations only found a lot of chipped ceramics and scraps of mummy cloth. Many of the tombs had already been raided by local robbers. So Davis gave up, assuming the valley had been exhausted. That's where Lord Carnarvon stepped in and kept Carter in expedition money. Carter was convinced there was a tomb hidden under all, a tomb belonging to a king named Tutankhamun. His theory wasn't baseless. He'd already found a cup, streaks of gold foil, and funerary items, all which bore inscriptions of that name. Years passed as Carter's men dug deep into the bedrock, but the tomb remained undiscovered. The digs were costing a fortune, so Carnarvon pulled the plug, but Carter pleaded for one last chance to find the lost king's resting place. Then, in early November 1922, while excavating near the base of the tomb of Ramses VI, they found a carved step in the rock leading to an underground tunnel. On November 6, 1922, Carter, elated by the discovery, sent an urgent cable to Carnarvon in England. The message invited his benefactor to Egypt to witness what could be a historic moment. On November 23rd, Lord Carnarvon turned up at the site with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. The workers were still clearing the staircase, 16 steps in total, leading down into a sealed doorway. As the men dug through the rubble at the door, they found seals with Tutankhamun's name on them. Carter peered through a hole into the darkness of the chamber, his hands trembling as he tested for gases with a candle. Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Carter's assistant stood behind him as a rush of hot, earthy air almost put out the flame. And then he saw it. Gold. Gold everywhere. A room full of strange statues of weird animal carvings and so many precious things he could hardly believe his eyes. The next day, the door came down, revealing the antechamber, filled with ornate boxes, necklaces, beautiful bracelets, and more gold than you could imagine. Outside the door was an omen, although in their excitement, Carter and Lord Carnarvon didn't think so much about it. 2 foreboding black and gold-colored statues stood at 6.3 feet tall, each of them holding staffs. They'd guarded King Tut for 3,000 years, and now men were rampaging in front of their eyes. Carter and his men found a second chamber also filled with many hundreds of priceless artifacts, enough to fill a museum. But the best place was to come, the burial chamber. There was a golden shrine for King Tut, surrounded by walls painted with scenes from his funeral. The sarcophagus, a huge block of quartzite carved with images of protective goddesses, contained 2 gilded wooden coffins in the shape of a human. Inside one was a coffin, a wondrous gold structure weighing over 110 kilograms. Opening it up, Carter and his men saw the mummy, which was covered in 150 objects, rings, daggers, and amulets to help the king through his journey in the afterlife. Tut was a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty who ruled Egypt from 1332 to 1323 BC. He came to power at the age of 8 or 9, but like so many other inbred Egyptian royals, he was far from a picture of good health. He likely walked with a cane, a consequence of his club foot. His spine was curved, his body was frail. At just 18, he likely succumbed due to complications from a broken leg, made worse by an infection or malaria. Carter and his crew had insulted the gods by raiding his tomb. To add insult to injury, they desecrated and defiled his body by pulling off his bandages. If you're superstitious, you might have said these guys had a death wish. This became evident about 6 months later on April 5, 1923. Lord Carnarvon, a man so wealthy he could afford the most advanced healthcare medical science had to offer, dropped dead. The night his lights went out in Cairo, the city had a power cut, plunging the residents to complete darkness. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. After his passing, a rumor emerged covering every man who'd taken part in the plunder like a black fog. People started talking about the curse. The ancient Egyptian rulers had made it clear, no trespassing on our graves, or else. Shameless thievery and desecration would incur the wrath of the gods, including Thoth, scribe of the gods, whose words of warning were abundantly clear. Cursed be those who disturb the rest of a pharaoh. They that shall break the seal of this tomb shall meet death by a disease that no doctor can diagnose. This could hardly have been any truer for the death of Lord Carnarvon. While he was still bathing in the success of uncovering that priceless bounty, he felt a tiny prick on his cheek. Brushing his hand against his face, a spot of blood stained the end of his finger. He'd been bitten by one of the many mosquitoes that plagued Egypt. Days later, with his trusty cutthroat razor in hand, he carefully drew it down his lathered face. The blade reopened the bite wound, a small nick that seemed insignificant at the time, but it was a decision he would come to regret, though he didn't yet know it. The following day, sweat poured down Carnarvon's face as he lay shivering in bed, his body waging a battle against a worsening infection. The bite had led to a severe blood infection that quickly spiraled into sepsis. Soon the best doctors in Cairo surrounded him, trying in vain to halt the relentless progression of the illness. But there was nothing they could do. On a balmy night at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, Carnarvon passed away from complications due to pneumonia. At the time of Carnarvon's death, Carter and his men were still in the process of using hot knives to strip the bandages from the mummified body of King Tut. It was a tricky operation due to the passing of time and the fact that resin poured over the bandages had hardened. They'd already gotten as far as the head, a wizened and shrunken face. It was then that they noticed it, a lesion on the king's face, right where the mosquito had bitten Carnarvon. Media teams from all over the world took notice. From London to Sydney, Australia, people opened their newspapers a day later to read Lord Carnarvon's death. Superstition aroused, Pharaoh's malign influence. The excavation was still ongoing and things had not been going so well. And now the man who made it all happen was dead. Carter was not a man of superstition, but he couldn't ignore a series of frightening incidents that had taken place soon after he'd opened the lid of that coffin. The very day the tomb was opened, one of the most startling things they found were golden serpents, cobras, in the crown of two statues. When Carter returned home to dine in the garden with some of his men, the calm of the night was shattered by a great commotion from inside of the house. Curious and alarmed, Carter rushed to see what was happening. To his disbelief, he found a cobra devouring the canary he'd bought to ward off the loneliness of a life in a foreign land. The men took note, as did Carter, that the serpent looked eerily familiar, almost like the golden snakes they'd seen earlier that day. Carter's native staff regarded this as an omen. They were petrified, warning that this was the spirit of King Tutankhamun. The English Egyptologist Arthur Weigel said the Egyptians might see this as a warning. He explained that it would be perceived that the royal cobra had broken into Carter's house to kill Carter, not a canary. Weigel was actually there on the day of the tomb opening, covering it for the Daily Mail. As Carnarvon walked down the stairs, he joked, "If he goes down in that spirit, I give him 6 weeks to live." Turned out to be a pretty good prediction. Weigel wasn't superstitious, but he was right about the locals seeing this as the work of the mummy's curse. One of them wrote, "The serpent from the crown of the king has eaten the golden bird. Bad luck will follow." When Carnarvon died, Carter was beset by people coming up to him and talking about curses. The world's press hounded him while a popular writer penned a story about a dire punishment. Among the spectators to behold the treasure of Tutankhamun's tomb was wealthy financier George J. Gould. Soon after viewing the tomb's riches, Gould set off on a journey across Europe, eventually arriving at the French Riviera. But before he could enjoy the splendor of the destination, he fell ill with pneumonia. Just weeks after Carnarvon's death, on May 16th, Gould succumbed to his illness, another name added to the growing list of those claimed by the curse. Carter had to do some serious reflection when the news of another death came to him one morning. Carnarvon's half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, had died from a blood infection after an unnecessary dental operation. People were still queuing up to see the splendor of the tomb, but it seemed the trip wasn't worth making. A Canadian professor visited one day, and he died of sunstroke the day after. According to Time magazine, two prominent röntgenologists, specialists in using X-rays to diagnose diseases, were summoned to examine Tutankhamun's body, but they died before they even reached Egypt. All of these deaths didn't go unnoticed in America. The New York Times in 1923 wrote about the, quote, theories about vengeance. There were plenty of them. Ironically, given his notability came from inventing the most logical detective in history, it was Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame who lit the fire under the curse theory. He told the press, "The death of Lord Carnarvon is not a mystery. It was caused by a pharaoh's curse." Then in 1924, the British Egyptologist Hugh Evelyn White, a man who had been at the tomb at the opening, was reported dead. This time, there was no mysterious infection. It involved a gun in the back of a taxi. But still, this didn't discount the possibility that he had been cursed. The next guy to clock out early was Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who was invited to X-ray the mummy. He died in Switzerland, also in 1924, at the age 52. The public started taking the curse seriously. One newspaper article told them those most intimately connected with the tomb during the last few months suffered in some way or another. Even the journalists who covered the story have felt the reaction. 3 of them have been ill. Then it was discovered for the first time that an inscription on Tut's tomb had actually warned people this would happen. It said, "Death shall come on swift wings to whoever disturbs the peace of the pharaoh." All over the world, newspapers reported that Carter had hidden the tablet that contained this inscription because he didn't want to spook the other men. Carter might have hidden a few other things, but we'll get to that later. Just as the fear surrounding King Tut's curse began to fade into history, it struck again. In 1928, Arthur Cruttenden Mace, one of the most vital archaeologists at Carter's side during the tomb's discovery, fell gravely ill. As always, it was terminal. He died at the age of just 53 after years of health issues, despite having access to a life of luxury and advanced medicine. Of all the deaths tied to the curse, none troubled Carter more than the fate of his loyal personal secretary, Captain Richard Bethel. He had been by Carter's side through every step of the discovery in Egypt. On November 15, 1929, Bethel, 46, was found dead in his bed. The cause of death? Smothering. The shocking discovery set off a storm of speculation, with rumors swirling about a murder tied to the secretive Mayfair Club, where rich men allegedly directed global affairs. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, who'd gladly accepted gifts from the tomb, was found dead on the ground outside St. James' Court in London a year later. Moments earlier, he had been in the bathroom on the 7th floor. A newspaper wrote that this was the 10th death connected with the excavation. American James Henry Breasted, who'd spent much of his life excavating in Egypt, passed away in 1935. Another Egyptologist and a good friend of Lord Carnarvon, Aaron Ember, died in 1926, in a house fire trying to save his precious manuscript. The name of this manuscript? The Egyptian Book of the Dead. The curse of King Tut now seemed real for much of the public, but the one man who should have been at the center of King Tut's wrath was Mr. Carter, and Carter was alive and kicking. But not for long. After years spent touring around the world giving speeches, he passed away from lymphoma in London on March 2, 1939. He was just 66. It was later discovered he had very likely stolen from the tomb, surely much to King Tut's immortal fury. Carter didn't care, he never believed in curses, calling them tummy rot and foolish superstitions. So, was the curse he didn't believe in finally over when he died? That's a matter of opinion. One of his friends, Sir Bruce Ingram, a British publisher and archaeologist, might have become another victim of the curse of the pharaohs. Among Ingram's possessions was a gift from his dear friend, Howard Carter, a paperweight fashioned from a mummified hand. The hand, still adorned with an ancient bracelet, bore an ominous inscription. In 1963, with the paperweight still on Ingram's desk, he died. It was no big deal. He was 85, a good run, as they say, But the media wasted no time in pointing out that after he had been given that gift, his life had incurred a series of major tragedies. Shortly after Carter gifted him the hand, the house that contained it burned to the ground. When the house was rebuilt, it wasn't long before disaster struck yet again, when a flood caused serious damage. And yet again, the world's press had a field day. Mummy content back then was guaranteed to go viral. And with that in mind, let's get a bit more skeptical. Egyptomania and the curses were incredibly popular in the English-speaking world as far back as the Victorian era, long before Carter's discovery. Mummy mania was very lucrative, and so were curses. So the media didn't mind publishing what you might call early 20th century clickbait. This brings us back to the death of Lord Carnarvon, which hit newsstands all over the world. The fact that he was felled by a mosquito so soon after he rankled King Tut's spirit is quite remarkable. But, and it is a big but, Carnarvon had been a sickly man. Carnarvon had always been a sickly child, but what truly changed the course of his life was a near-fatal car crash in 1901. The accident left him with lasting health issues, particularly recurring lung infections. Seeking relief, he relocated to Egypt, drawn by its warm, dry climate, ideal for his frail body. So when Carnarvon was hit by a blood infection, unlike a healthy person with a fully functioning immune system, he couldn't fight it off. His death was not that unusual. Also, Carnarvon was buried without an autopsy, which makes the mosquito bite story matching the lesion on the mummy a weak theory. As for the power that cut out that night, well, Cairo had them constantly and still does. Some media said when Carnarvon died, a man named Lord Porchester back in England reported that Carnarvon's dog had let out a great big howl and dropped dead. But in reality, Lord Porchester was in India. Bear in mind that Britain's tabloid media over the years has proved itself to be a factory of misinformation. In fact, when Carter found the tomb, he made a deal with the Times newspaper, which meant it got all the information from Carter. Only Times journalists were allowed the scoops. For this reason, the other papers needed a unique angle, and that angle was the curse. The most shameless piece of misinformation was when the paper said Carter had hidden a tablet containing the inscription, which you'll probably remember read, "Death shall come on swift wings to whoever disturbs the peace of the pharaoh." That simply wasn't true, although the warnings on some other tombs were definitely real. Still, how come when men found those other tombs, they didn't all drop dead? As for Ingram's mummy hand, there's no actual proof it existed. When anyone even vaguely related to Carter died, the press started coming up with colorful theories, and it seems many people believed them. Some men closely connected to the discovery did die in their 50s and 60s, but in 1930, the average life expectancy in England was just 59. Sure, wealthy people tended to live longer than flat-capped industrial workers, but without antibiotics, infections could easily become lethal. As you know, at least 10 people died within 8 years of the discovery, but there were 58 men there on the day the tomb was opened. They survived another 23 years on average, and many of them were already gray-haired when Tut's tomb was opened. And you would think King Tut would have gotten Carter first, given that Carter led the expedition and, as we now know, stole from the tomb. If you were King Tut, who would you have murdered first? Carter or someone like Carnarvon's half-brother who never even so much as seen the unveiling, never mind laid a hand on the sacred mummy? Then you have people like Sergeant Richard Adamson, a member of Carter's team who guarded the burial chamber for 7 years, ensuring locals didn't steal artifacts. He was as close as anyone to Tut's remains out of those 58 people, yet he lived for another 60 years until he died in 1982. Dr. Douglas Derry, who led the unwrapping of Tut's bandages in 1925 and was the very first anatomist to work on the body. He was basically the chief desecrator, but he didn't pass away until 1961, age 87. And what about Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, who was just 21 when she was a witness to pretty much everything that went down at the tomb? Did she succumb to curse fever? No, she died age 78 in 1980, when Motorhead's Ace of Spades was a lot more exciting for the public than mummies and curses. There's always a rational explanation for the curses. With the Tut case, scientists pointed out that thousands of archaeologists over the years had worked on the excavation of tombs in Egypt, and they didn't come down with curse fever. One said if by desecrating tombs you were given a death sentence, there wouldn't be any archaeologists left. The curse wasn't real, but it made a good story. What do you think? Was King Tut's curse real, or just a spooky coincidence? Should Carter have left the tomb untouched? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Now you should watch the Thai Diamond story, Cursed Diamond Causes Rift Between Countries, or have a look at Real Curse of the Hope Diamond.